The trial of the gods. The solution Persephone proposed was unthinkable. The gods themselves would be judged, not symbolically, not mythologically, literally. Every god, Olympian, chthonic, forgotten, would face the court of irreversibility, not to be punished, but to be defined. What purpose did they serve now? What harm did they perpetuate? What would remain if belief vanished entirely? Olympus erupted in outrage. Zeus called it treason. Ares called it humiliation. Hera said nothing, because she remembered kneeling. Hades allowed it, because Hades had never feared judgment. The day the gods stood still. When the trial began, time slowed. Not stopped, but restrained. One by one, gods stepped forward, not as rulers, but as functions. Poseidon confronted the devastation of his temper. Apollo faced the suffering caused by ambiguous prophecy. Athena acknowledged the wars prolonged by necessary strategy. Zeus was last. He stood unarmed, not defiant, exhausted. And when Persephone asked him who he was without worship, without fear, without thunder, he had no answer. That silence ended Olympus, not in destruction, but in redefinition. Gods were no longer absolutes. They were participants. The final judgment. The last judgment was not death. It was limitation. Gods would persist, but constrained by consequence. Mortals would suffer, but no longer be tools. The underworld would remain, but only as a place of resolution, not control. Hades accepted the ruling without hesitation. Persephone accepted it with grief, because power surrendered is still power lost. And yet, something extraordinary happened. For the first time since creation, the universe felt stable, not orderly, not peaceful, but honest, the last question. As the trial concluded, a soul stepped forward. Not a hero, not a king, not a god, an ordinary mortal. They asked a question no one had prepared for. If even the gods are no longer eternal, then what is the point of meaning at all? Persephone answered, not as queen, not as goddess, but as someone who had chosen winter over innocence. Meaning does not come from eternity, she said. It comes from responsibility. When nothing lasts forever, what you choose to protect finally matters. The soul nodded and walked into rest. Epilogue. The king who remained Olympus still exists, but it no longer commands the universe. The underworld still endures, but it no longer terrifies it. Hades remains on his throne, not because he must, but because someone has to stay when the story ends. He does not demand worship. He does not offer salvation. He does not promise justice. He guarantees closure. And Persephone? She walks between realms, spring and winter, beginning and end, ensuring neither forgets the cost of existing. Final truth. Death was never the enemy. The gods were never the villains, and immortality was never the prize. The greatest lie ever told was that power meant freedom from consequence. Hades knew the truth from the beginning. The strongest ruler is not the one who cannot die, but the one who accepts that everything must end and rules anyway. Part 5. The Last Judgment is not death. Death has always been misunderstood. Mortals fear it. Gods weaponize it. Stories glorify it. But death, true death, has never been the final judgment. The final judgment is what remains after death no longer frightens anyone. Chapter 5. When even the end is no longer enough. The universe did not collapse after the revolt of the forgotten gods. That was the problem. It continued. Mortals still lived, gods still ruled, seasons still turned. Yet something essential had been stripped away. An invisible guarantee that meaning would arrive automatically, that justice would follow inevitability, that endings would explain beginnings. They did not. And in that absence, the most dangerous question ever asked began to spread across realms. If death no longer resolves anything, then who does? The failure of Olympus attempted reform. Zeus announced new covenants. Athena proposed ethical warfare. Apollo refined prophecy to reduce collateral suffering. None of it worked, because Olympus had never been designed to answer questions, only to command belief. Worship declined not in rebellion, but in irrelevance. Mortals prayed out of habit, not faith. Heroes hesitated. Kings ruled without divine certainty. The gods felt it. Power remained, but legitimacy evaporated. And power without legitimacy rots. The burden of the underworld below. The underworld flourished and suffered. Souls found clarity. Closure became possible. Tyrants faced truth without spectacle. Victims were no longer erased by heroic narratives, but something else emerged. Some souls refused closure. They did not want redemption. They did not want punishment. They wanted continuation. They wanted to argue forever. The underworld faced a paradox. If resolution was forced, it became tyranny. If it was optional, chaos returned. Hades recognized the danger immediately. Persephone did not. The disagreement that almost ended everything. For the first time since their union, Hades and Persephone disagreed fundamentally. Hades argued for boundaries. An ending denied is a wound that never closes. Persephone argued for autonomy. An ending imposed is a lie wearing mercy's mask. They were both right, which meant the system they had built could not survive unchanged. The underworld, the most stable structure in existence, was approaching its limit. Not because of rebellion, but because of panics. Zeus attempted force. Lightning struck the null and passed through them. You cannot kill what exists between definitions. Ares charged at shadows that would not bleed. Apollo's prophecies returned static. Athena's strategies unraveled because the enemy did not want victory, only disruption. For the first time, Olympus and the underworld shared a realization. They were not prepared. The Council of Ashes Persephone called a council unlike any before. Not of gods, but of those wronged by gods, former heroes, failed prophets, monsters who had obeyed divine orders only to be condemned afterward. Souls erased from myth for being inconvenient. She listened. And in listening, she did something unprecedented. She admitted fault. The underworld, she declared, had become too obsessed with endings. Olympus, with beginnings. Neither had protected the space between, where identity survives change. The revolt of the forgotten gods was not unjust. It was incomplete. The counter-move. No one expected Persephone did not attack the null. She legitimized them. She offered recognition, names restored, roles redefined. Not worship, but acknowledgement. A place in cosmic structure that did not rely on fear or sacrifice. The null fractured, because revolutions fueled by erasure cannot survive recognition. Some accepted, others refused. Those who refused revealed themselves, not as liberators, but as nihilists. Hades understood then. This was not a war for power. It was a war over whether existence itself needed meaning. The final battle of Chapter 4, the last confrontation, occurred not in Olympus or the underworld, but in the void between realms. There were no armies, only arguments made manifest. Persephone faced the core of the null, an amalgam of forgotten divinity and abandoned purpose. They asked her, "If even death now demands understanding, what refuge remains for those who want oblivion?" Her answer was devastating. Oblivion is not refuge. It is refusal. She did not destroy them. She contained them within a realm where nothing progressed and nothing ended, a perpetual unresolved state, a prison worse than Tartarus, because there, even rebellion had no narrative. Aftermath, a universe changed forever. The revolt failed, but it succeeded in one thing. It proved that neither Olympus nor the underworld could ever return to what they were. Hades accepted that inevitability without meaning is tyranny. Persephone accepted that meaning without endings is chaos. Together, they forged a fragile equilibrium. Above, the gods of Olympus retreated into spectacle. Below, the underworld redefined itself, not as a place of death, but as a guardian of resolution. And somewhere between realms, the echoes of forgotten gods whispered a warning that would shape the final chapter. Power that refuses to be remembered will always return as something far worse. Part 4. The Revolt of the Forgotten Gods. Every empire fears rebellion from within, but the most dangerous revolutions are born between empires, where no one is watching. This war did not rise from Olympus, nor was it commanded by the underworld. It came from those erased by both. Chapter 4. When oblivion learned to speak. They had no temples, no names spoken in prayer, no constellations to mark their fall. They were the forgotten gods, minor deities, discarded titans, half-divine beings whose relevance expired when their usefulness ended. Some had once governed rivers now rerouted, stars no longer observed, virtues that mortals stopped pretending to value. They did not die. They were unremembered, and unremembered power does not vanish. It festers. The birth of the third power. The revolt did not begin with violence. It began with coordination, fragments of divinity, scattered across time, diluted through neglect, began to resonate. Old contracts resurfaced. Pre-Olympian oaths activated. Names erased from history whispered themselves back into existence. In the spaces Olympus ignored and the underworld categorized, something assembled. They called themselves the Null, not a faction, a correction. Their belief was simple. Greater than if the universe only remembers what is useful, then usefulness must be destroyed. The first strike, the shattering of Lethe. Their opening move was brilliant. They poisoned the river Lethe, not with corruption, but with clarity. Souls who drank from it no longer forgot. They remembered every injustice, every manipulation, every false promise made by gods who claimed inevitability as virtue. The underworld trembled. Lethe was not merely a river, it was a failsafe. Without forgetting, eternity became unbearable. Order risked collapse. Hades reacted instantly. Persephone hesitated, because she understood what the revolt truly was. Not an attack on death, but a rebellion against closure. The forgotten declare war. The Null did not seek to rule. They sought to invalidate. They attacked Olympus by draining belief. Shrines dimmed. Oracles contradicted themselves. Gods found their names harder to remember, their authority increasingly questioned. They attacked the underworld by flooding it with unresolved souls, those who refused judgment, refused dormancy, refused peace. Tartarus cracked. Old titans stirred, not as conquerors, but as symbols. Even Kronos' shadow echoed faintly, not alive, not dead, but resentful of relevance lost. The universe stood on the brink of conceptual collapse. If death could not end stories, and worship could not sustain gods, then what remained? Hades makes his first mistake. For the first time since creation, Hades acted too quickly. He sealed sections of the underworld, he restricted movement, he tightened inevitability into suffocation. The result was disaster. Souls rebelled, not violently, but philosophically. They refused categorization. They rejected verdicts. They demanded narratives instead of endings. The underworld's greatest strength, order, became its vulnerability. Persephone confronted Hades. "You taught me inevitability," she said, "but you never taught me meaning when inevitability fails." It was not accusation. The first god to kneel. It was not Zeus who broke. It was Hera, queen of Olympus, patron of marriage, architect of appearances. She entered the underworld not in chains, but in secrecy. She did not demand absolution. She demanded understanding. Persephone granted neither. Instead, she asked a single question. How many lives were destroyed to preserve your image of order? Hera had no answer. She knelt, not to beg, but to acknowledge. The moment was never recorded, but Olympus felt it. The Queen of Heaven had bowed to the Queen of Winter. The myth begins to change mortals. Notice the shift first. Death became less theatrical. Glory lost its shine. Heroes returned quieter, or not at all. Stories ended without triumph, and that frightened people, because stories without triumph force reflection. Did not seek devotion. She sought maturity. And maturity, once introduced into a system built on fantasy, acts like poison. The cost of ruling the end Persephone paid a price. Each winter she spent below, spring weakened above. Life became harsher. Crops failed. Mortals cursed her name without knowing why. She accepted it. A queen does not require love. She requires coherence. Standing beside Hades, she looked upon a kingdom no longer defined by death, but by resolution. Yet she knew Olympus would not forgive this transformation. And gods who cannot forgive eventually retaliate. Part 3. The Queen Who Learned to Rule. Winter power does not always arrive with fire. Sometimes it comes with frost, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Persephone did not become queen of the underworld the day she crossed its gates. She became queen the day she understood why it must never resemble Olympus. Chapter 3. The Making of a Sovereign. At first, the dead saw Persephone as a contradiction. She carried spring in her name, warmth in her memory, light in her voice. In a realm sculpted from endings, she seemed misplaced, an echo of life in a kingdom that survived on its absence. They underestimated her, the education of a queen. Hades did not teach Persephone how to rule. He taught her how to watch. He showed her the ledgers of eternity, records not of sins, but of patterns. How tyrants always justified themselves. How heroes confused praise with virtue. How revolutions failed not because they were crushed, but because they copied the systems they claimed to overthrow. Persephone listened. She walked the fields of asphodel and spoke with souls who had lived unremarkable lives, yet suffered extraordinary consequences. She descended into Tartarus, not to punish, but to observe monsters who had once been tools of divine justice, and now understood they had been discarded the moment they became inconvenient. She learned the truth no Olympian ever faced. Evil rarely believes it is evil. It believes it is necessary, and necessity, left unchecked, becomes cruelty. Winter as strategy. The seasons changed above because Persephone was absent. Below, something far more dangerous occurred. She restructured the underworld not by force, but by delay. Judgment slowed. Reincarnation paused. Reward was postponed. The dead waited, and in waiting they reflected. Winter was no longer punishment, it was containment. Just as fields rest beneath snow to regain strength, Persephone understood that souls required stillness to shed illusions. She introduced cycles of dormancy, periods where nothing happened, and everything changed. This infuriated Olympus. Gods thrived on motion, prayers, sacrifices, wars, spectacles. Persephone weaponized silence. The Court of Irreversibility. Her greatest reform was the establishment of the Court of Irreversibility. Here, even gods were subject to review. Not judged, but evaluated. Every divine intervention that caused mass death was recorded. Every war inspired for vanity, every hero engineered for narrative convenience, every city sacrificed to prove a point. Olympus called it blasphemy. The dead called it justice. Persephone presided without anger, without mercy, without apology. Her rulings did not seek balance. They sought closure. A soul judged was never recycled into propaganda again. This terrified Zeus more than open rebellion ever could. The Cold War of the gods' Olympus responded not with armies, but with influence. Dreams were seeded. Oracles whispered doubt. Mortals were encouraged to fear the underworld once more. Persephone anticipated this. She did not counter with fear. She countered with truth. Souls were allowed to speak through dreams, not prophecies, but testimonies. Kings saw the faces of those they had ruled. Priests dreamed not of heaven, but of the questions they avoided answering. Faith fractured. Not because gods were challenged, but because they were understood. Cade steps back. This was Persephone's war now. Hades watched as she outmaneuvered Olympus without raising a blade. Where he had built foundations, she constructed institutions. Where he enforced inevitability, she introduced meaning. Together, they formed something unprecedented. A realm that did not require worship. A kingdom that did not need to expand. A power that did not depend on fear. The underworld became a mirror. Those who entered it could no longer lie to themselves. The gods begin to bleed. It was Ares who broke first. He entered the underworld expecting battle, glory, resistance. What he found was indifference. Shades did not fear him. Veterans of countless wars looked upon the god of war and asked a single question. Is this all you ever were? Their words weakened him more than blades ever could. Apollo lost prophecy. Hermes lost passage. Even Athena faltered, confronted by strategies that prioritized ending war rather than winning it. The Olympians discovered an unthinkable truth. The underworld was not trying to conquer them. It was trying to replace their relevance. Zeus and the unseen king. At last, Zeus descended. Not in humility, not in secrecy, but in rage. He demanded Hades appear. Hades did, not armed, not angry, present. They stood across from each other, brothers once united against titans, now divided by philosophy. Zeus spoke of order. Hades spoke of consequence. Zeus demanded the gates reopen. Hades replied with a sentence that ended the war before Zeus realized it had begun. You rule the living because they fear death. I rule the dead because they understand life. The silence that followed echoed across all realms. Zeus left, not defeated, but uncertain. And uncertainty, to a god who thrived on obedience, was the most dangerous wound of all. Aftermath, a war that never officially happened. No treaties were signed, no victories declared. Olympus resumed its feasts. Mortals continued to pray. But something fundamental had shifted. Heroes no longer rushed to die for glory. Prophecies ended with ambiguity. And the underworld, once a shadow, became a destination of truth. Persephone stood beside Hades as the dead reorganized themselves not as prisoners, but as citizens. The war had not ended. It had simply matured. And above the earth, the gods of Olympus began to sense what mortals would one day understand. The greatest threat to power is not rebellion. It is legitimacy. The silence before the storm. Zeus felt it first, though he did not name it. Poseidon sensed unrest in the tides of fate. The Olympians laughed louder, feasted harder, demanded worship more fiercely. But Hades did not move. He never moved first. Beneath the earth, the dead gathered. The old Titan scars reopened. Ancient contracts were rewritten. Persephone stood beside her king, crown forged not of gold, but of consent earned in darkness. The underworld was ready, and the living world, oblivious and arrogant, continued to believe death was the end. They were about to learn. Death was merely the beginning of the war they had ignored. Part 2. The war no mortal ever witnessed wars are remembered by those who survived them. This one was not meant to be remembered. No mortal sang of it. No temple recorded it. No constellation marked its end. The war between Olympus and the underworld unfolded in silence, fought not on fields of blood, but in corridors of fate, in treaties written with memory, in battles where victory meant erasure rather than triumph. And it began not with a scream, but with a door closing. Chapter 2. When the dead refused to stay. Dead, the first sign was subtle. Heroes who should have returned to Olympus did not. Their souls lingered. Their destinies stalled. Oracles faltered, visions blurred, prophecies contradicted themselves. Zeus blamed mortals. Poseidon blamed the tides. Athena, wiser than most, said nothing. Because Athena had noticed the imbalance. The underworld was no longer passive. The closed gates Hades issued no declaration. He simply changed the rules. For the first time since creation, souls bound for Olympus were delayed. Not denied, not punished, evaluated. Every hero, every demigod, every favored champion was measured not by glory, but by consequence. The dead waited, and waiting, in the realm of eternity, is an act of violence. Olympus called it an error, a disruption, a clerical imbalance in the cosmic order. Hades called it sovereignty. The dead belong to me, he said, his voice carrying through realms without echo. And I will no longer release weapons back into the world without knowing who forged them. This was not rebellion. It was administration, Persephone's doctrine. It was Persephone who formalized what Hades had only implied. She named it the doctrine of finality. No soul would leave the underworld unchanged. No hero would be returned without reckoning. No god would be allowed to use death as a temporary inconvenience. This doctrine spread like wildfire among the dead. Warriors who had died 1,000 times for Olympian amusement refused rebirth. Kings who had sacrificed cities for divine favor demanded trials. Even monsters, once tools of divine punishment, sought asylum within structured oblivion. The underworld began to fill not with the defeated, but with the disillusioned. Olympus had lost its monopoly on purpose. The siege of memory Zeus responded as he always had, with force. Thunder tore through the veil between realms. Lightning struck not bodies, but records, attempts to erase contracts, undo laws, rewrite the past itself. The result was catastrophic. Memory is the underworld's foundation. When Olympus attacked it, the dead did not scream. They remembered. Every injustice, every broken oath, every hero used and discarded. The rivers overflowed with rage. Shades armed themselves with truth sharper than steel. Titans long dissolved into legend reassembled in spectral form, bound not by flesh, but by grievance. This was not an invasion. This was an uprising, the battle without time. There are no clocks in the underworld. So when battle erupted, it did not unfold in moments, but in states. Hades did not charge. He positioned. Corridors collapsed behind Olympian scouts. Rivers shifted, separating allies from allies. Cerberus guarded choke points not with savagery, but with patience, 3 heads watching 3 futures at once. Persephone commanded from the court of Asphodel. Her orders were precise. "Do not destroy them," she said. "Teach them." The Furies hunted not soldiers, but liars. Charon stopped charging coins. Transport was granted only to those who admitted why they fought. Judges of the dead rewrote sentences mid-conflict, turning executioners into witnesses. Olympian forces found themselves fighting an enemy that refused spectacle. Every victory felt empty. Every defeat felt permanent. The first war of the dead. It is said, never sung, never carved, that the underworld saw war before Olympus knew peace. A coalition of rebel spirits, led by the remnants of Titan generals and fallen demigods, rose against the new king. They believed death made them free. They believed no god could truly rule those who had nothing left to lose. They were wrong. Hades did not meet them with lightning or storms. He met them with time. He sealed corridors, redirected rivers, starved the rebellion of memory until their leaders forgot why they fought. When battle finally came, it was not glorious. It was surgical. Cerberus tore through ranks like living siege engines. The Furies hunted commanders through dreams that no longer belonged to them. And Hades himself stood unmoving, helm veiling his presence, unseen but inescapable. The war ended without surrender, because surrender requires hope. The underworld learned obedience that day, not through terror, but through certainty. The king who watched, not ruled. Olympus mocked Hades in whispers. They called him distant, cold, unfeeling. They did not understand that while Zeus ruled with thunder and Poseidon with fury, Hades ruled with observation. Every soul that passed through his realm was a lesson. Every tyrant revealed the limits of fear. Every hero exposed the fragility of glory. Hades learned the truth of gods and mortals alike. Everyone kneels eventually. The difference is how long they pretend they won't. And so he waited. Enter Persephone, the seed of war. The abduction is how poets tell it. The truth is bloodier. Persephone was not stolen from a field of flowers by a lonely god drunk on darkness. She was taken from Olympus itself, from a world rotting beneath gold and laughter. Demeter's daughter had seen the cracks. She had watched gods smile while mortals starved. She had heard the whispers of souls denied rest because Olympus needed heroes, not peace. Hades did not choose her for beauty. He chose her because she saw what others refused to see. Their union was not romance. It was strategy. When Persephone crossed into the underworld, something ancient stirred. The dead felt it first, a warmth not of mercy, but of purpose. Seasons shifted above, yes, but below, the kingdom changed. The queen had arrived. The underworld, transformed Persephone, did not soften Hades. She sharpened him. Where Hades brought order, Persephone brought growth, not of flowers, but of institutions. Courts were restructured, punishments refined, redemption, rare, costly, dangerous, became possible. This terrified Olympus. Because the underworld was no longer merely a destination, it was becoming a state, a rival ideology to the heavens. And war, true war, does not begin with weapons. It begins with ideas. The king who never needed the sun. The gods feared Hades not because he ruled the dead, but because he never begged the living to worship him. While Olympus bathed in sunlight and applause, while Zeus thundered for loyalty and Poseidon shattered seas to remind mortals of his name, one god ruled without spectacle, without temples filled with hymns, without statues raised in public squares. His kingdom had no sky, no dawn, no mercy, and yet it endured when others faltered. This is not the story of death as an ending. This is the story of power without illusion. This is the story of Hades, the underworld, and the war that never ended. Chapter 23. The inheritance no one wanted. When the cosmos was young, and the Titan blood still steamed beneath the soil of creation, victory did not bring peace. It brought division. After the Titans fell, the three sons of Kronos stood before the smoking ruins of an old world: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They were brothers forged by betrayal, sharpened by war, and bound by a victory that tasted of ash. The universe had to be divided. Lots were drawn. The sky went to Zeus, vast, visible, worshipped. The seas went to Poseidon, violent, restless, endlessly feared. And to Hades fell the realm no god envied, the dominion no hymn would ever praise, the underworld. Not darkness alone, but everything the light refused to acknowledge. Hades did not protest. He did not bargain. He did not curse fate. He descended. And that silence, the refusal to complain, was the first act of war, the birth of a kingdom beneath. For the underworld was not born whole, it was conquered. Before Hades, death was chaos. Souls wandered, shrieked, clawed at memory. Titans loyal to the old order hid in the cracks of oblivion. Ancient horrors, nameless, pre-Olympian, fed on the lost and the forgotten. Hades did what Zeus could not. He organized the unorganizable. He built walls where none existed. He drew borders through shadow. He forged law from inevitability. The rivers of the dead, Styx, Acheron, Cocytus, were not merely geographical features. They were weapons, boundaries designed to break rebellion before it began. Every crossing drained something essential: courage, memory, hope. Hades understood something his brothers never did.